Hi guys, Peter here on the Sibo solution, and today I'm going to go and give you so much information that literally nobody else knows. And it's quite complex. So it's quite complex going into the mechanisms and the causes. So I've broken it into two parts, the mechanisms and the causes. Now, this information is quite dense. And I really do recommend that you have a look at it, maybe look at it again, and maybe look at it again, and maybe look at it again, just to get an understanding of what's causing it. Because if you can understand that, then you can implement later on your own program. Now, even though I'm going to give you the programs, essentially, this enables you to have the flexibility. But as I said, it's quite dense. I've tried to break it down as much as possible. And let's give it a go, guys. This is part two, mechanisms and causes of the Sibo solution. And I promise you, it will blow you out of the water, because it's just such cutting edge information here. First of all, there are lots of mechanisms, and I've listed a couple down here, like gastric and small intestinal pH, and I'm going to go into that. And you've heard me talk about that lots and lots already. Your pancreatic issues, bile acid, bile issues, something called the MMC, the migrating motor complex, which moves everything through the gut. And that's a big player in SIBO. Immune dysfunction, microbiome dysfunction, and a raft of other issues in there. And one of the reasons why the vast majority of programs out there don't work, in fact, I don't think any of them do, is because they're looking at one part. And as I've already highlighted in the first part, SIBO isn't just, look, SIBO and it doesn't affect the rest of the body. It might affect the whole gut. In fact, it more than likely is affecting things like a reflux and things up in your stomach and even your esophagus, right down to your large intestine, colon, diarrhea, constipation, and inflammatory bowel conditions. So the whole idea that it's separate, and then you've got your autoimmune conditions I've mentioned earlier, and things like fibromyalgia, arthritis, they're all linked with it. And so that's why this solution, I'm giving you the mechanisms to understand everything that goes behind it at the current state of information. And essentially what we've got is a gastrocolic reflex. That is essentially, as soon as you eat, it sends mechanisms down. Have you ever noticed, by the way, when you eat something, 10, 15 minutes later you want to go to the toilet, the food hasn't gone through. What it's done is set up this reflex mechanism throughout the body to say, new food's on the way. Okay, let's clear it out. So this gastrocolic reflex is literally how it all communicates along your system to move foods through, to empty it out, to do the right nutrition, and so on. And the thing that alters it a lot is obviously the type of foods we eat, how we eat, when we eat, which we'll be talking about later. So the consumption of a food, as I said, a meal can trigger this off, and the regulation of it varies depending on where you are. The esophagus is different to the stomach. And what we do know that in the stomach, it's contained or controlled largely by your vagus nerve. Now, this is the nerve that goes from the brain down to our digestive system. That's part of the gut-brain axis that everyone talks about. And this vagus nerve actually has a excitatory part where it says, okay, let's move it through quickly, and an inhibitory part, which is slow it down. Now that works in the stomach, but what we do know, it doesn't have much of an influence on the small intestine. But again, the stomach and small intestine work in concert here. So understanding that there's a role for your vagus nerve, and hence when I talk about solutions, I'm going to say make sure your nervous system is in tune and ready to go and getting the right nutrients, and of course functioning. Now the role of the vagus nerve, as I've said, is pretty well in controlling the stomach, movement through the stomach. And what's called a vagotomy, where they cut the vagus nerve, which is one of these many, many silly operations they do, unfortunately, realizes that it actually stops the motor nerve in the stomach, the motor movement through the stomach and so on. But it doesn't actually affect the small bowel very much. So coming back to it, normal motility in the small bowel is a significant development in SIBO. So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, you know, the bacteria and the fungi. I'm going to talk about fungi and something called archaea later on. But all of these are literally in there. And one of the major contributing factors here is the fact that it's not moving through. So if things aren't moving through, then we've got something wrong with this migrating motor complex. It's the housekeeper of the gastrointestinal tract. It sends the waves down, and there are 3 different levels. One, which is a quiet time where it's just pulsing along very slowly and it just moves it very slowly. Intermittent, where it's moving a little bit faster. And phase 3, which is the critical part in coming up with a Sibo solution. We need to generate phase 3, because phase 3 is when your small intestine is starting to go boom, 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 and pushing it through. So that's the stuff that really clears it out. It's the phase 3. And that gets rid of all the food, the microorganisms in there, the secretions, you know, bile, for example, pancreatic secretions, all those things. And as soon as that finishes, the next cycle begins. So 1, 2, 3. And if you don't get to phase 3, that's when things sit in the small intestine and move really slowly, and as a result, enable the microorganisms to breed up in there. So what it consistently shows, Sibo patients have a very slow, small bowel transit time. So your small bowel, which I'll refer to as small intestine, small bowel multiple times. I'll change the terminology, often because of how the studies refer to them. And you'll note that all of this information is referenced. Now, I only put 1 reference, but usually there's half a dozen or dozens of references in some cases to highlight exactly what I'm saying. So what we do know is the movement through the small bowel is very, very slow. So what we've got here, those with LBT, which is your lactulose breath taste, so that's one of the indicators of Sibo, was 6.6 hours, and those who didn't have it had 4.2 hours. So it's a third extra time. Now, later on, you'll see that it can actually be even greater than that. So at the end of the day, we know patients who have are indicating through the Sibo, through the lactulose breath test, positive, they have a much longer period of time at which it sits in there. It's delayed. So the transit through that bowel is delayed. Now, if that's delayed, then those microorganisms breed up, produce the gas, and so on. So what is it that affects the movement through the bowel? And there's only a couple of studies on this, and the first one dates to first couple date back to the 80s. And essentially, they show that the cycle, one of the main factors in the cycle of the small bowel movement, the migrating motor complex cycle length, is increased with pH, alters with pH. And as I'll show you in a moment, the more acidic your small intestine is, remember your stomach has to be, I'll come on to this, the stomach has to be acidic, your small intestine has to be alkaline. So if your small intestine becomes a little bit acidic, it slows it down. And we don't want that. So what we want to do is move it on. So here's the picture. So in our mouth, it's alkaline. In our stomach, it's acid. In our small intestine, that orangey, squiggly little bit down there, it's supposed to be alkaline, which is what we've got to work on here. And your large intestine, the green bit there, the pH is about 3 to 4. So it's slowly becoming more acidic. Now, the idea is in the beginning of your small intestine, it has to be alkaline, but as it moves through, it's obviously going to have more bacterial fermentation and it'll become slightly acidic. But the critical part is at the beginning of the small intestine, the duodenum, it has to be alkaline. And without that, your migrating motor complex won't work. Now, the problem we face here is that the connection between the stomach and the small intestine. And if you're not digesting in the stomach and you're not getting the right pH in the stomach, you're not triggering off the mechanisms that are going on in the body, in the small intestine and further down. And the unfortunate thing is, and here is a bit of a hint, the typical American-based diet, and this was obviously a study reported out of America and around the world where I look for these studies, it has a pH. It causes the stomach, because it's so processed and because it's large in amount and so on, it has a pH of about 4 to 5. Now, the ideal scenario is your pH of your stomach should be about 2 to 1.5. And that 2 to 1.5 isn't just a barrier to the microorganisms, but initiates all of the following feedback loops through the small intestine. Now, what we also find in malnourished children in Bangladesh, Brazil, and other parts of the world, that if malnourished kids, one of the signs or symptoms of malnourishment is they will often have signs and symptoms of Sibo, and one of these is the fact that they have a more alkaline stomach instead of allowing it or getting to a pH. And the critical factor here is it's probably linked with nutrition. So let's go back, and if you've been to one of my seminars, you would have seen this before. I put it up, and your stomach, so we're going back to the stomach now. Your stomach has a critical role, and the critical role isn't just digestion, it's communicating with the rest of the body. But the three important factors in your stomach is first, digestion. You have to have an acid stomach to break down your minerals, iron, zinc, and magnesium. Now, if you don't get iron, zinc, and magnesium in your body, then things won't work. Your enzymes won't work. You won't have energy. So critical, when people come to me and they go, I'm low in energy, well, make sure you've got an acid stomach. So you have to have a pH of around about 3 to make sure you get the right digestion going in the stomach. The release of B vitamins, folate, B12, B6, biotin, one of the B cousins and so on, are all important to have a pH of 3. Now, remember, the typical American diet has a pH of 4 in your stomach and takes a couple of hours to catch up. At a pH of 2, your proteins untangle and you get digestion. And so if you don't have a pH of 2 in your stomach, then you're not getting the digestion, the amino acids that make up your collagen for your skin and your intestines. You don't make up your neurotransmitters that communicate through your body, your serotonin, your melatonin, your gamma aminobutyric acid. All of these are made up of the building blocks of proteins called amino acids. So you have to have these. And if you're not getting to a pH of 2, then you're not able to actually digest them. If you're not digesting them, you can't absorb them because they're too big. So we've got to get the pH right in the stomach. And this is already giving you a bit of a hint and why other programs don't work, because they focus on the symptoms down the line rather than dealing with the underlying causes. So what causes the pH to be too alkaline? Well, one of the things I've already mentioned is our diet, how we eat, the huge size of them, the processing of them, all of them alter it. But we'll go into that later in the solutions. Filtration. Now, what's critical here is your stomach is a major organ of filtration. It stops everything that's out here from getting down into your small intestine and large intestine. It's a barrier. And that barrier is literally the pH. The more acidic it is, the less toxins will get through. Toxic chemicals, for example, the poisons in the air can get broken down in the acid environment. The toxins in terms of allergens, these are the things you find in dairy, like casein and gluten in your grains and so on. These are proteins, and if they're not digested in your stomach, then they get through, causing inflammation later on in the system. But in terms of what we're talking about here, your pH of the stomach is a barrier to all of the microorganisms. And every single breath you take, everything, every gulp, every bit of food you have, every bit of water has microorganisms in it. Now, it's not, don't panic about it. What's critical here is to make sure your stomach has a pH or lower to 1.5 to 3. Because then it actually acts as an effective barrier. Now, if you don't have that barrier there, you are going to get all of these microorganisms going into your small intestine with the food that's not digested. And guess what? You're going to exacerbate SIBO conditions and all these diseases that are linked with diarrhea and so on, things like Clostridium and Salmonella and Shigella and Campylobacter. So we know that happens. So we have to make sure that stomach acidity stays where it is. But this is the other link that it has, the stomach with your small intestine, is it coordinates everything. It coordinates everything with going on down. So there are these receptors in your small intestine that talk to your stomach, and your stomach that talk to your small intestine. And your coordination in your small intestine is set off by having a strong stomach acid. Now, if you don't have a strong stomach acid, then it doesn't get the messages down later to inject the sodium bicarb to alkalize your small intestine. I'll show you this later. It doesn't get to inject the enzymes to start working. It doesn't. So these messages are really important. So we have to make sure we've got a strong stomach acid all the time. And this is where we'll go into and discuss some of these things. And understanding that, then, what is it underlying that moves the thing through our small intestine? And it's a what's called a peptide, a neurotransmitter hormone called motilin. Motilin meaning moving through. And this motilin is what initiates the phase 3 contraction in the small intestine. So we've gone into the small intestine and we want to push everything through. So what causes it? This motilin. Now, motilin, you may have heard of the hormone neurotransmitter called ghrelin. That's the one that you have when you're hungry. And that's a hunger signal, okay? Now, they work a little bit together, and I mention them later on. But what happens is motilin is unique in its function in the small intestine, and that's what actually creates the movement, the phase 3, to clear out. So if you've got any condition that slows down the motilin release or doesn't allow it to release, e.g. morbid obesity, so morbid obese people can't produce enough or don't produce enough motilin to get the phase through, hence they are more prone to Sibo type, because in conditions they're not getting the movement through. Now, ghrelin is also in the small intestine. This is the one that signals hunger, and it's linked with motilin, but it's only a minor player in it. And as I also said earlier, the vagus nerve is a minor player in all this. And how they know this is if they alter the level of motilin in the body. So they give you an injection, which is down there on the right. And when they say exogenous administration, they mean an injection or ingestion of motilin, or something that stimulates the motilin receptors actually initiates phase 3. So the ideal scenario here is we're going to get things that mimic or create the release of motilin so that the phase 3 gets out and empties it. Now, if you're not getting the motilin in there, in other words, if you're not getting the phase 3, you're not going to fix the Sibo. So changing your diet is fantastic and have a little impact and lots of benefits in there. But is it getting the phase 3 going? So we need to delve into it. What is it that drives it? And what we now know without any doubt whatsoever, and I'm not going to go through all this page because the information is there for you. But what we do know is that if you've got an alkaline, that is a pH of 7 or 8 in your small intestine, it stimulates the release of the motilin. So it all comes back to pH. Your stomach has to be acid, and your small intestine has to be alkaline. So when they've injected sodium bicarb into animals that have the equivalent of Sibo, it's evoked a strong gastric contraction in the stomach and a release of motilin in the body, in the small intestine, and it clears it out. However, if they do the reverse and increase the acidity of it, it does the exact opposite. It slows the contraction down. So in all the studies where they've added it or taken it away, altered the pH, we know that it's the alkaline environment that releases or causes the release of the motilin. And in cases where they're Sibo, we know small transit time was longer, 10 versus 1.1 hour, and the gastric pH was much more alkaline. So there are studies in there suggesting, right? Studies in there suggesting that your gastric pH has an implication, which is what I'm telling you, on the small intestine. And as a result, you get that very slow transit time, which gives the microorganisms a huge amount of time. Now, there's another product in here that you would know of, your bile acids. And bile acids are made up of lots of ingredients in there. And some of these are the chemical messengers for the body. And I'll show you some of the functions later because it's important to understand. But we now know that the bile acid is essential for your migrating motor complex in your small intestine. So while motilin induces, while motilin will induce a gallbladder release and cause the stomach to move, if you don't alter the pH, the literally the bile isn't released and the motlin doesn't work. So it's all got this interesting connection. So bile empties in the duodenum, your small intestine, the top of your small intestine, during a phase 2, and soon as the motlin is released, soon as the bile is released, the motlin is released about 25 minutes later. So the bile's released, the motlin goes out, and as a result, we get the phase 3 contraction occurring. So it's pretty simple, and I've got this all here, but it's all pH dependent, because the bile is only released once you've got the right pH in the small intestine. And as I show you up here, and this is my little model, and you're the first people to see this. So your stomach acid, pH, gets the migrating motor complex going through the stomach, and that's with the benefit or the help of the vagus nerve. Now that, because your stomach is acid at a pH of, let's say, 2, very acidic, it initiates a small intestine sodium bicarb release. SI there means small intestine. So bicarb is injected in from the pancreas into your small intestine, and bicarb has a pH of 8 point something or other, so it alkalizes. So in fact, all the functions in the small intestine are about alkalinity. So the small intestine is injected with sodium bicarb from your pancreas. It alkalizes the small intestine. When it does that, it causes a bile to release during phase 2, which is pumping it gently. The bile also has an impact on alkalizing, because bile is alkaline, and bile also has very potent antibacterial and microbial modulating properties. So it controls what microorganisms are growing in there. So this bile release is so important. Hence, while I'm going to mention bile later on, and that bile release then causes the motlin release, and the motlin release causes the phase 3 go. So stomach acid, small intestine alkaline, bile release, motlin release, and off goes small intestine, and then the cycle repeats itself. What a great, and that's what we're after. So if you understand the mechanisms in there. So what happens and how does the bile come? Well, bile is this product that gets a bit of a bad rap at times, because you've got bile-related reflux and so on, but it gets a bad rap. And sometimes people are told, have your gallbladder out and so on, you don't need it. I'm sorry, it has an important function to release the right amount of bile at the right amount at the right time. So following a meal, more than 70% of the stored bile is expelled into the top of the small intestine, okay, into the top of the small intestine. And as it does that, it increases the intestinal motility. Now, bile also has lots of other functions. In other words, it helps break down all the proteins and gets rid of all fats and so on. It actually helps separate the fats out, and therefore the body can work on it better. But it gets rid of all the exogenous, which are the toxic fatty substance that we might be taking in through our diet. And so it gets that out, and it's able to separate some out to the kidneys and then some out to the body. It emulsifies all of your fats, so you get the fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, K. You have problems with bile, you're short of you may be short or deficient in your fat-soluble vitamins. Now, you're probably going, what has this got to do with it? Well, your gallbladder has to be functioned properly to produce the bile salts, to do all this, to be able to get the motility going, you see the link in there. It's, trust me, it's a lot more complicated than I'm showing you here, but the bile salts are critical for the nutrients, the fat soluble nutrients, and you need lots of those to have a functional body. Now, your bile is a major eliminator of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a building ingredient of bile, and it regulates the cholesterol and the triglycerides. So anyone with cholesterol problems probably has bile problems and small intestine problems. So instead of trying to stop the production of cholesterol, what you do is you fix it up at where the problem is, in the gallbladder, in the small intestine, and so on. And it recycles all of the bile and the cholesterol back into the system, and most of it just gets recycled time and time again. But also your bile contains hormones and neurotransmitters and chemicals that can affect your whole small intestine, how it grows, maintaining it, the barrier function of it, so it's stopping toxins getting in and out and things like that. So your bile has really, really important functions. And your bile acids is critical for messaging everything so it works there together. Now, your bile also has important immune functions. Without going into the detail, what it does, the bile has immunoglobulins in it, parts of our immune system in it that have antibacterial properties, and it has other antibacterial properties. So it actually poisons the nasty bacteria and the nasty fungi and the nasty archaea in the gut. So your bile is not just alkalizing your small intestine, but it's cutting down the number of bacteria. If they got through into your small intestine, it's starting to kill them and control them. So it will control the nasty ones. Interestingly enough, we know that when the bile salts are altered, the microorganisms can alter the bile salts, and the bile salts can alter the microorganisms. So again, it's a bit of a feedback loop. But what we want to do is make sure we get the bile functioning properly, so it's alkalizing your small intestine, and that it's killing off the microorganisms, it's having these antibacterial properties. So what happens is, one of the things that happens in your small intestine is the bile comes in and it's attached to some amino acids, and that's called conjugated bile acids, so the normal bile acids. And as the microorganisms, if you've got Sibo or an overgrowth of microorganisms in your small intestine, then they start to literally break away those amino acids, and we end up with what's called unconjugated bile acids. Now, what's important here is a lot of recent studies have been saying, well, hold on, you can actually measure someone. You can take a blood reading of them now. You can take a sample of blood, and you can measure these unconjugated bile acids in the blood of people. And as a result, because they're not being dealt with properly, they're being fermented rather than processed properly by our normal system, and they're in the blood. And so it's now considered a way, or one of the ways that we can measure by Sibo by using blood tests as well. But it's showing that this bile, also the wrong type of bile or too much of it, is getting into the blood, and that causes its own ongoing problems. Now, here's the gallbladder Sibo link, because the bile is normally stored in the gallbladder. And what we know now is that there's a huge amount of problems associated. If you've got any gallbladder illness, condition, then you will end up with a much greater likelihood of Sibo, SIFO, methanogen organisms growing in there. And you'll see that word there that says cholecystectomy. That's actually removal of the gallbladder. So removal of the gallbladder and gallstones, and apparently a lot of people have gallstones without even knowing it, is an indicator that Sibo is either on the way, so it's a precursor, or Sibo may be contributing to it too. So we know there's again a two-way link between your gallbladder. So instead of removing the gallbladder, fix the small intestine, get the pH right, get all this happening so it works properly again. So all of the studies show that if you've got gallbladder problems, then gallstones, gallbladder problems, you have had removal of it, then you've got Sibo conditions time and time again. And we also know, independent of Sibo, that if you've got gallstones and or you've had your gallbladder removed, the time at which it moves through, in this case, in the studies they call the orocecal transit time, so how much time does it take to move through the whole system, is dramatically delayed, doubled in fact in most cases. And the more severe the gallstones, the longer the delay period in the transit time. So again, we've got to go back to basics. Ripping out the gallbladder isn't going to fix, because it's a vicious cycle. If you have problems with the gallbladder, it delays the transit time. If you delay the transit time, you're going to get Sibo. Sibo feedback is then that it will contribute to the gallbladder problems, and it's a vicious cycle. And what we want to do is the exact opposite of it. We want to reverse it. And so what we want to do is fix the pH, fix the gallstones, gallbladder all at once. And that's why, I look at this as a total approach, because if you're just altering the food, you're on a FODMAP diet that I mentioned earlier, or if you're on another program, without looking at all of these things in here, you're only doing treatments. You're not coming up with a solution. So we also know, for example, because of the role with the gallbladder, Sibo, gallbladder, gallstones, fat, how it digests fat, there's a strong link with hyperlipidemia, which is blood fat levels. Now, this is a real risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So by working backwards and fixing up the gallbladder, fixing up the digestion in the small intestine, we reverse these conditions as well. What a great idea, isn't it? Fantastic. Now, the gut microbiome also plays a role in the migrating motor complex. And what we know is that the right type of microorganisms in there keep it going, speed it up. If the wrong type of bacteria and fungi and archaea get in there, and they slowly increase, they move as they go through the duodenum into the rest of the small intestine, they will increase in numbers. And what we know is if you've got germ-free rats, so these are rats that are born in a germ-free environment, they've been had antibiotics repeatedly, they get fewer activity fronts in their MMC. In other words, they don't get the movement going through their small intestine. They don't get the bump, 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 bump phase 3. So we know that the microorganisms in the small intestine are a critical factor in stimulating that as well. So we don't want to get rid of all of them. We don't want to get rid of all of them. We just want to get rid of the bad ones, and we just want to lower the number. So there's a delicate balance between the right type of microorganisms in the small intestine and getting all of the migrating motor complex and all those other factors going in there. So how does, or what's going on? So the problem with small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, Sibo, Sifo, IMO, all these conditions, is that there's fermentation of carbohydrates literally in the small intestine. Now, the problem with that is that they're producing things like acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. And everybody knows that they're really good in your colon with your microbiome. When people talk about the microbiome, they're really, really fantastic down there. However, what they do is poison the small intestine. So the short chain fatty acids, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid, they first of all make it more acidic, which is what you don't want. So if they're sitting there too long, it inhibits nutrient absorption and it inhibits what's called the jejunal motility and something called the ileal brake, which is how your body controls the movement through your intestine, through your small intestine. And it has to be, the movement through your small intestine can't be too fast. It has to be fast at the beginning to push through, but the rest relies on going through at a moderate speed so that it can absorb all the nutrients. So this fine balance, and short chain fatty acids upset that. Now, on top of that, what we know is these microorganisms that are growing in your small intestine, because you've got to bear in mind that the reproductive rate of small intestines is in the vicinity of minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So if we're talking about things that are delayed for 5 or 6 hours, you can imagine then in 20 minutes, it's doubles in number. Then in 40 minutes, it doubles again. So 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, 32. You can see how high and fast it gets very rapidly. And that's why the transit time is so important. And what we know is these bacteria, the fungi, the archaea also produce toxins. And one of them is a group called lipopolysaccharides, LPS. I mentioned those in my talks. And that also poisons the nervous system around the gut and slows it all down and causes problems. So everything's working against it. So we've got to get this right back in balance. Now, the different types of Sibo that we've mentioned, and there are different names for it. And with all these courses, I'm updating things. So later on, I'll tell you new changes in names, and so so you don't get confused. And there are lots of titles and terminology in the scientific literature. I often have to alter it and keep some consistency. But you've got your Sibo subtypes. One is hydrogen producing, and that's often called H-Sibo. And you've got your methane producing, which is M-Sibo. But then you've also got your IMO, and you've got other titles. But at the moment, we'll just stick with these ones. Now, your methane producing one, methane in your small intestine, like those other toxins that I mentioned earlier, LPS, your short chain fatty acids, these also slow the transit time. So methane has a big impact on slowing down the transit time. And it's interesting that the methane producing bacteria and archaea, so you might have something like M-Sibo, it's much more prone to diarrhea subtype of Sibo. So yeah, very important, and I'll talk about this later on, come back to it multiple times, to get not just for your hydrogen and lactulase, but also for Sibo, for your methane, because that may be a contributing factor here. Now, I've mentioned these already, but I want to come back to it because it's a little bit confusing at times. And so there's a group of microorganisms called archaea. Now, these archaea, they used to be called bacteria. And it's only recently they've broken off and said, hold on, these aren't bacteria. They're a different type of microorganisms, a single cell microorganism like bacteria. But these archaea are the main ones that produce methane. So again, these are the main ones that produce methane, not necessarily the bacteria and the fungi. So it separates out what type of organisms are creating what type of conditions, what type of Sibo you've got. Now, it's also important to understand what's called the ileocecal junction, and that is at the end of your small intestine that connects up with your large intestine. Now, when your large intestine, what we want is as many microorganisms, healthy microorganisms preferably, as possible, producing the short-chain fatty acids. And what we want to do is stop them coming back up into the small intestine. And unfortunately, what happens is with Sibo, we have a lower pressure in that last part of the small intestine, the ileocecal junction, the ileum. So the pressure in there is lower, consistently lower than if you've got a healthy small intestine. So if it's got lower pressure, things can actually come back up, and as a result can cause lots of problems with what's called ceco-ileal or ileocecal reflux. So literally the microorganisms in the large intestine can actually flow up. You want them in the large intestine, you don't want so many in the small intestine, so you get a bit of a problem. And again, that's caused by the slow transit time. And another term that they'll talk about is how the junction pressure, if it's low, then they're indicating that it's Sibo. So this then takes me back to the top of the small intestine. This is the duodenum. So we've just come straight out of the stomach and back into the duodenum. And that's where digestion occurs. Your pancreas secretes in, I'll show this later, your pancreas secretes in enzymes to start digesting foods. And that needs a pH that's alkaline. But there's other enzymes in there too. For example, when you start to chew food, you have amylase, and you would have heard of that. That's in your saliva. And that amylase starts to break down food. So chewing on something with carbohydrates in it, it breaks it down really, really well. Top of your stomach, it breaks them down, and then it gets in the acid part and it stops because the salivary amylase can't function at that level in an acidic stomach. So when it gets into the small intestine again, even without any introduction of other enzymes from your pancreas, digestion of your carbohydrates starts. Now, you've got to remember that Sibo is referring to an inappropriate digestion of carbohydrates, right? Sibo is referring to an inappropriate. And what we're after here is to get these carbohydrates broken down as quickly as possible in the small intestine from the salivary amylase and from your from your pancreas, because that actually then prevents or stops the food being available for the microorganisms. And so it's the acidic environment in the small intestine that stops digestion, and as a result, fermentation occurs again, just showing you the importance of pH. Now, here I want to touch on the pancreas. And without going into any detail, your pancreas is a critical and a major organ for digestion. It's producing a whole raft of hormones which alter digestion and all around the body, and enzymes. And these enzymes to break down fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And ideally, they work in a pH of around about 7 to 8. Now, remember that if you have this breaking down all the food, breaking down the carbohydrates and breaking down, then they're not fermented. And when they're fermented, they produce gases. So we don't want those gases. So we want your pancreas working fully. And so what we want to do is provide as much help as we can to the pancreas and reduce the pressure so it's got lots of enzymes and do all the work. Your pancreas also releases sodium bicarbonate, which is alkali, the alkalizing agent. And sodium bicarb has a pH of 8, which enables your small intestine to be about 7.5. And as a result, all the digestion occurs, and that stops the microbial growing as well. Now, here's a little hint. The problem we face is our pancreas is exhausted, run down, tired, like the rest of our digestive system. I'm going to go back and give you a basic tip straight away. Start eating smaller, less processed meals. All of your foods come with their own enzymes to digest themselves. And so it takes a lot of pressure off your pancreas. And if you're having these large processed meals, and in the case with when they do it with rats and mice in the labs, they find that their pancreas is literally inflamed, pancreatitis, because they're working so hard to produce the enzymes to digest the food that should have been easy to digest. And that's where raw foods come into it. And this is where multi-enzyme preparations, these are supplements, and I'll talk about them later, can help take some of that pressure off the pancreas. So where are we? I've given you a huge amount of information. I'm going to stop here right now, and I'm going to get you to have a think, maybe reflect on it, and reflect on how important that pH link is, and the pH bile, the pH bile motilin, the pH bile motilin, and the motor complex moving through the small intestine. That is a critical driving factor, and that's controlled by the pH in the stomach as well. So lots of factors in there. And if you just consider having a look at those, reflecting it, and I'll put up part B will be up there as well. So once you've had a relook, learn about this, you'll be able to, understand the rest of it too.